Hey, Dean Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend the communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Dean Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly. Well, since the Julius Jones case is back in the news, I thought it would be important to focus on the Innocence Project, which is his defense team's other debauchery when it came to defending guilty people. And that is the case of Stephen Avery. The series was called Making a Murderer. I believe they're all 10-part series, an hour apiece, 10-part episodes, and there were 2 seasons. And I invested a lot of time in watching it, and I was fascinated by it, and I actually believed everything that was in it. I had no reason not to. I had no idea who the Innocence Project was, and I was very convinced by the visual elements that was presented to me over 20 hours. Now, if you don't know the Stephen Avery case, I'm warning, there's a couple of spoilers. Stephen Avery was wrongfully convicted of raping a woman. He spent a lot of time in jail, and then he was exonerated, rightfully so. But then another body ended up on his property. There was a murder case after he had gotten out of prison. The documentary made many false assumptions, but one of them, of course, was that the police department in that neighborhood was so upset at Mr. Avery and how he'd made a fool of them that they'd set him up for this second murder. Being a fan of the show, I actually went out and got a couple of books on the subject. First, I got the prosecuting attorney's book, Mr. Katz, on the subject matter, and I knew which direction he'd be coming from because he was actually the prosecuting attorney, and he maintains, of course, to this day that Mr. Avery is guilty. Mr. Katz was an interesting character because he faced a couple of, I believe, sexual assault allegations, and I believe he was misusing narcotics, and so eventually he was dismissed. However, of course, this alone doesn't refute anything that he says about the case. It's amazing to me that most people will just buy into the conspiracy simply because they watched the series. And of course, another new lawyer had taken on the project, and she has also written a book about the framing of Stephen Avery. All of this is mostly nonsense. Now, if you hadn't known that the Innocence Project's devious ways and that they operate in, that they tend to defend guilty people, you would have had no inclination to go out and do any kind of sort of reading on the subject. You would figure that this is a documentary, and that you would have watched it and thought that you've known the truth. For 20 hours, you would have sat there in front of your screen watching this documentary, practically a fakementary. This fakementary is so absurd, it should be considered a lesson in propaganda. Being a fan of the show, I actually went out and did read 2 books on the subject, Katz, and the other book was called Indefensible. The obvious direction that Mr. Katz would be the attorney would be that Avery was still guilty, he was the attorney at the time, and I knew that that would be his stance. The other book was more interesting. The author of Indefensible had previously written a book on Avery and about how Avery, at the time of his first trial, where he was proved innocent years later after spending, I believe, a decade in prison, was actually innocent, and that he'd looked into the subject and he thought that it was a miscarriage of justice then. So this is an unbiased person who wrote an entire book about the first Avery case, writing a second book, and he comes to the conclusion that while Avery was innocent in the first, is guilty of the second. And he makes it very clear why.
Ah, the curious case of Stephen Avery. The vast fantastical police conspiracy. Do you believe in fairy tales? I hope so, because you're going to need a downright childlike ability to suspend disbelief in order to get your arms around all of the coincidences, the circumstances that would have had to line up smoothly and perfectly, the conclusion defying all logic required for law enforcement to pin Teresa Halbach's murder on an innocent Stephen Avery. Let's lay out this spun-up conspiracy, shall we? Have some aspirin handy. It's going to make your head hurt. Deputies Link and Colburn, with no history of misconduct or dishonesty, would have had to locate Teresa Halbach's RAV4, determine that Teresa had been murdered or decided to kill her themselves, and drive the SUV from wherever it was they found it to hide it at Avery's Auto Salvage without being detected sometime between October 31st and November 5th, 2005. They must have known that Teresa was last seen at the Avery property on the date of her disappearance, unless by an incredible stroke of luck, the person they chose to set up for her murder just happened to be the last person to see her alive. Nobody can see them plant Teresa's license plate in a junkyard vehicle on the lot. No Avery can find Teresa's car before other, less crooked cops do, or before it's stumbled upon by citizen searchers. They would need Teresa's blood to spread around the back of the SUV. They would need Avery's blood, not the vial of blood in the clerk's office, as that contained EDTA, but blood from the actively bleeding Avery himself. They would need the body of the 25-year-old victim, which these officers must have been prepared to mutilate and burn. Her body couldn't have been burned and broken already when they found it, remember? Or they'd have no way to know for sure it was Teresa. Later, they'd have to sneak up to the Avery property, coming within 20 feet of Steve's back door to distribute her bones, a tooth, and a rivet from her jeans in the fire pit, remembering to burn some additional tires to intertwine fragile bone fragments into the steel belts, and using Steve's rake so that bits of the same belts could later be recovered from between its tines. For some reason, they must decide it would be best if the bones were found in more than one place, so they have to deposit it in 4 of the larger bones in the burn barrel behind Dassey's residence. Busy night for Andy and Jim. It goes without saying that nobody could see the officers burning Teresa's body or chopping it up or observe them planting the tiny and incredible brittle pieces of bone in the Avery burn pit and the Dassey burn barrel. And this, nobody, includes Steve's loud and protective dog, Bear. They'd also have to hope that several citizens saw Avery with a large bonfire at the exact location they chose for their bone planting, and on the very evening that Teresa went missing. Andy and Jim would be busy and lucky, spectacularly so. But we're just getting started. These ruthless, corrupt, dirty cops would have to slip into Calma County evidence lockup or the Madison Crime Lab, depending on the date, and borrow Stephen Avery's rifle, the same gun that deposited 11 shell casings found in his garage during the original search. Here's where it gets a little more difficult. They have to shoot the rifle, collect the bullet fragments, return to the secret stash of Teresa's DNA, and plant her DNA on the bullet fragment, and then plant the bullet in the Avery garage under an air compressor, sometime before March 1st, 2006. They couldn't leave the footprints in the snow that led to the garage, and they had to hope that someone would tell the police that the murder happened in the garage so that law enforcement would get a search warrant to look for the bullet. If you've managed to follow along so far, it gets even a little more complicated. These two dirty, dastardly, disgusting cops have to collect non-blood DNA from Stephen Avery. Not an easy task, as any perspiration they collected had to have Avery's skin cells sloughed in it, and plant the DNA on Teresa's car key with the blue fob that matched the National Guard lanyard in her locked SUV, and plant the key in Avery's bedroom while under observation by Clement evidence techs and a host of other searchers and police officers on scene. They also had to plant some of this non-blood DNA under the hood of the victim's SUV, on the hood latch, either before it was discovered or while it was held in the custody of either the Madison Crime Lab or the Clermont County Sheriff's Department. Then they had to hope that Stephen's nephew, or another person willing to implicate himself, would someday tell officers that Avery reached under the SUV hood, the tip needed to corroborate the hood latch story, leading to the DNA's collection in April of 2006. Okay. Almost done. Andy and Jim had to obtain the victim's phone, digital camera, and PDA. They had to burn those items in Avery's burn barrel, the same barrel that Blaine Dassey and Robert Fabian saw Avery himself burning items in October 31st. Another stroke of luck for Andy and Jim. They had to do this sometime before November 5th without anyone noticing, which would take hours. They lucked out again when Brendan Dassey told investigators that Uncle Steve burned the contents of Teresa's purse in his own burn barrel. If the cops weren't the ones to kill Teresa themselves, they'd have to be lucky enough that whatever method chosen by the real killer left no inconsistencies between the bullets they planted, the 2 skull fragments with gunshot holes surrounded by tiny lead particles, and the findings of the forensic anthropologist and forensic pathologist. They couldn't leave any prints or DNA themselves, naturally, and neither could the real killer. Or if he or she did, his or her prints and DNA wouldn't be able to be in the DOJ identification system, or couldn't be in the DOJ identification system. And finally, no witnesses or potential members of the conspiracy could talk about it any time thereafter, ever. Oh, and by the way, nobody else anywhere could see Teresa alive after she was at the salvage property on October 31st, as that alone would totally destroy the Avery did it charade. She couldn't use her phone after she arrived at the Avery property, ever. Stephen Avery couldn't have had an alibi. Luckily, he and Teresa had the same 2-hour period of cell phone inactivity after her visit before her cell phone was disabled permanently. Luckily, he'd chosen to take off work the afternoon of October 31st for the first time ever. Luckily, he specifically requested Teresa as a photographer and made some blocked calls to her that day and then a non-blocked call after she left, and lied in early interviews about whether Teresa showed up at all and about whether he had a fire that night, all of which helped him look suspicious. Avery was a real help in his own framing. Andy and Jim owe him big time. you have to assume that these guys hated Avery enough that they were willing to risk not only their jobs, but also going to prison themselves for the murder of Teresa Halbach and for planting evidence. That's a bushel of hate, but neither Lenk nor Colvin faced financial pain from Avery's lawsuit against Manawak County. In fact, pop that last aspirin and maybe pour yourself a drink too. Andy and Jim both thought Stephen Avery should win his case. Two veteran cops who had heard "I'm innocent, officer" more times than they could remember believed a local man deserved a payday at the expense of the sheriff's department. Quote, "I thought Stephen, whose kids went to school with my kids and whose tow trucks the department used from time to time, deserved to get paid," Colvin said. "I kind of felt bad for the guy," end quote. That's sympathy, friends, not thumbing animus. Jim Lenk themselves, remembers the day Teresa's RAV4 was found. Quote, "As soon as I rolled up in the salvage yard that very first day, I know it would be under a microscope, scrutinized and watched every step of the way. Nobody could have planted evidence at that scene if they wanted to. The allegations, planting evidence that we conspired to get Avery convicted are just ridiculous, almost fantastical." Further, let's take a look at the supposed timeline here. Avery has given at least 9 different stories of his contact with Teresa on that day, not counting conflicting versions he's given to reporters. Innocent people don't lie about basic central questions in a murder investigation, like whether they had contact with the victim the day she was killed. Consider the following and try to think of an innocent reason for his inconsistent accounts. 10:31, approximately 4:30 p.m. Stephen tells Chuck Avery and Robert Fabian that Teresa never showed up at all that day. 10:31, approximately 8:57 p.m. Stephen makes no mention of Teresa Halbach's visit in his recorded call with Jody Stobowski. 11:03 afternoon. Stephen tells Scott Bloodrum, Teresa's roommate, that Teresa never showed up for her appointment on October 31st and is upset that he has even been contacted in connection with the disappearance. 11:03, between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Stephen calls to tell Auto Trader employees that Teresa never showed up on October 31st, but she called him and told him that she couldn't make it. He asked that they reschedule the appointment. Note, Stephen speaks to his nephew, Bobby Dassey, sometime after the November 3rd Auto Trader call, and for the first time realizes that there is a witness to Teresa Halbach's presence on the property that Halloween afternoon, Bobby himself. 11:03, between 6:30 and 7:30 p.m. Stephen finally concedes to Sergeant Andy Colburn that Teresa did, in fact, show up Monday afternoon, saying he saw her through the window but never made face-to-face contact with her. 11:04, approximately 10:20 p.m., Stephen tells Detective Remaker and Lieutenant Lenk that Teresa showed up, he did meet her, and in fact she was in his residence when he paid her for the photo shoot Monday afternoon. Okay. 11:04. Stephen tells David Beach that Teresa showed up about 2 p.m. and that he showed her a couple of vehicles and she took pictures. 11:05, 11:30 a.m. Stephen tells Marinette County Detective Anthony O'Neill that Teresa showed up between 2 and 2:30. He saw her take photos of the van, he went to meet her and paid her outside, and they exchanged small talk for about 5 minutes. 11:06, 8 a.m. Stephen tells Marinette County Detective Anthony O'Neill and DCI agent Kim Skowronski that Teresa showed up and Stephen went out to meet her. He paid her and gave her a note with the price he was asking. Teresa gave him an Auto Trader book but never left the car.
Making a Murderer prosecutor gives 9 reasons Stephen Avery is guilty. As you buckle in to watch Making a Murderer Part 2, there's something Ken Kratz would like you to keep in mind. He still thinks Stephen Avery is guilty as sin. Since Making a Murderer made him famous nearly 3 years ago, the former Wisconsin prosecutor hasn't been shy about defending his work in the 2005 murder prosecution of Avery and Brendan Dassey. Soon after the original documentary release, the rap reached out to him about suggestions in the Netflix docuseries that his office railroaded 2 innocent defendants. In an email, Kratz strongly rejected the criticisms, saying the documentary series got it wrong. He concluded by saying Netflix should either provide an opportunity for rebuttal or alert the viewers that this series was produced by and for the defense of Stephen Avery and contains only the opinion and theory of the defense team. Here is his email to us in its entirety. It begins with the Claremont County District Attorney's responding to our questions about whether he believed the docuseries left out any evidence. He responds as follows. Examples for you to consider. 1. Avery's past incident with a cat was not goofing around. He soaked his cat in gasoline or oil and put it on a fire to watch it suffer. 2. Avery targeted Teresa on October 31st at 8:12 a.m. He called Auto Trader magazine and asked them to send, quote, that same girl who was here last time, end quote. On October 10th, Teresa had been to the Avery property when Steve answered the door just wearing a towel. She said she would not go back because she was scared of him, obviously. Avery used a fake name and a fake number, his sister's, giving those to the Auto Trader receptionist to trick Teresa into coming. 3. Teresa's phone, camera, and PDA were found 20 feet from Avery's door, burned in his barrel. Why did the documentary not tell the viewers the contents of her purse were in his burn barrel just north of the front door of his trailer? 4. While in prison, Avery told another inmate of his intent to build a torture chamber so he could rape, torture, and kill young women when he was released. Even drew a diagram. Another inmate was told by Avery that the way to get rid of a body is to burn it. Heat destroys DNA. 5. The victim's bones in the fire pit were intertwined with the steel belts left over from the car tires Avery threw on the fire to burn, as described by Dassey. That was where her bones were burned, suggesting that some human bones found elsewhere, never identified as Teresa's, were from this murder was never established. 6. Also found in the fire pit was Teresa's tooth, ID'd through dental records, a rivet from the Daisy Fuentes jeans she was wearing that day, and the tools used by Avery to chop up her bones during the fire. 7. Phone records show 3 calls from Avery to Teresa's cell phone on October 31st. One at 2:24 and one at 2:35. Both calls Avery uses the star 67 feature so Teresa doesn't know it's him. Both placed before she arrives. Then one last call at 4:35 p.m. without the star 67 feature. Avery first believes he can simply say she never showed up, his original defense, so tries to establish the alibi call after she's already been there, hence the 4:35 call. She will never answer, of course, so he doesn't need the star 67 feature for that last call. 8. Avery's DNA, not blood, was on the victim's hood latch under her hood in her hidden SUV. The SUV was at the crime lab since 11/5. How did his DNA get under the hood if Avery never touched her car? Do the cops have a vial of Avery's sweat to plant under the hood? 9. Ballistics said the bullet found in the garage was fired by Avery's rifle, which was in police evidence locker since 11/6. If the cops planted the bullet, how did they get one fired from his gun? This rifle hanging over Avery's bed is the source of the bullet found in the garage, with Teresa's DNA on it. The bullet had to be fired before 11/5. Did the cops borrow his gun, fire a bullet, recover the bullet before planting the SUV, then hang on to the bullet for 4 months in case they needed to plant it 4 months later? Is that what happened? There is more, of course, but I'm not a DA anymore, he writes. I have no duty to show what nonsense the planting defense is, or why the documentary makers didn't provide these uncontested facts to the audience. You see, these facts are inconsistent with the claim that these men were framed. You don't want to muddy up a perfectly good conspiracy movie with what actually happened, and certainly not provide the audience with the evidence the jury considered to reject that claim. Finally, I engaged in deplorable behavior sending suggestive text messages to a crime victim in October 2009. I reported myself to the OLR. My law license was thereafter suspended for 4 months. I withstood a boatload of other consequences as a result of my behavior, including loss of my prosecution career. However, I've enjoyed sobriety from prescription drug use for over 5 years now, and refuse to be defined by that dark time of my life. All of this occurred years after the Avery case was concluded. I am unclear why the defense created a documentary chose to include this unpleasantness in this movie, especially if the filmmakers had no agenda to cast me as a villain. I'm not a victim in that whole texting scandal. Then again, it's exceedingly unfair to use that to characterize me as a morally unfit person. To identify Lieutenant Lenk, Sergeant Colburn, and myself as being responsible for the framing and knowing false murder conviction of Stephen Avery is irresponsible and inconsistent with consideration of all the evidence presented. Netflix should either provide an opportunity for rebuttal or alert the viewers that this series was produced by and for the defense of Stephen Avery and contains only the opinion and theory of the defense team.